Hi, good morning and good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. Today is very unique because we're co-partnering with Harris Bricken Law Firm, and we're going to be joined by Jonathan Bench, who's the co-chair of Harris Bricken, the Corporate Practice Board, and Joel Gallow, who is the CEO of Columbia China Business League, and myself, Brandon Hughes. Again, this is encouraged to be a lively discussion, so if you have any questions or comments, please ask in the Q&A portion, and we'll do our best to get to your questions. So we'll go ahead and move on. We're first going to introduce the speakers and let each one give a brief introduction. So we'll pass it over to Jonathan first.
All right, let's make sure everyone can hear me. Brandon, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me all right? Excellent. I am an international business attorney based in Seattle. I've been a student of China and Chinese for almost 20 years now. And so I guess I give a big Dajia Hao and Dede Homa to my friends in China. Very happy to be here with everyone today and be able to discuss CFIUS. I spend about half of my time dealing with Chinese clients and half the time with US clients, doing one side or the other of M&A transactions or contracts. So I'm fairly conversant in both issues on both sides, but a lot of times dealing with issues on Chinese investment coming to the US and how we can make that happen in a seamless way. It's been a few years since I lived in China, but I think of all my time there very fondly, and so I'm glad to be a part of this and get to talk about this topic and hopefully get to meet some of you in person at some point. Thanks, Brandon.
Oh, thank you very much. Great introduction. And next we'll have Joel Gallow. Go ahead and please introduce yourself for those who don't know you.
Great, thanks, Brendan. I appreciate the opportunity to join everybody here. My name is Joel Gallow. I am the CEO of Columbia China League Business Advisory Company. I am based out of Guangzhou, China, down in the south near Hong Kong, and we focus mainly on cross-border transactions between Asia, mostly China, and the United States. And that typically involves things such as NASDAQ IPOs for a Chinese company that want to access the US capital markets, joint ventures, M&A, etc. I've spent about 25 years working in global banking and technology. I think you could all see my background. I won't bore you going into the details. And I'm very excited to be here and partnering with both of you, and a hello to everybody that's joining us from around the world. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate the introduction. And then for those who don't know me, I'm the CEO and founder of FAO Global. I first got involved in China doing marketing in Beijing right after the Olympics, and I ended up staying there getting my master's degree in international relations at Tsinghua University. Since then, I've worked in two international think tanks. I've been an Army officer for 7 years before leaving and starting this firm. And I'm also doing an executive MBA right now with Columbia University in international finance. So what we do here is we bring a lot of different people together throughout our entire international backgrounds, and we brought it together to form FAO Global, which is essentially an international network of business consultants. We focus on competitive intelligence, management consulting, and cross-border expansion. So leveraging all these skill sets, our professional networks, and the expertise built up over the decade or two that our team brings, we're just excited to be able to share our thoughts and insights and bring our network in for this type of webinar. The views of each panelist is unique to themselves, so these do not represent the views of FAO Global as a company, but we encourage your participation. So any questions or comments you have, please let us know. And if you have questions afterwards, you can email us at info@faoglobal.com. And here is the agenda for today. We're going to be covering all these topics. If any of these are of interest or concern to you, or you have just general questions, please use the Q&A function or the chat function and let us know. So Jonathan, I'll pass it, or actually, yeah, if you want to go over this real quick, and then we'll roll into the other slides.
Sure, happy to give the overview on this, because everything starts with the laws. So the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. is not a new committee, but it is a recently enhanced committee as of 2018. So I won't bore you with reading that language. You can read it, and of course, when you review the slides later, you can look at it. But essentially, CFIUS has oversight on all foreign investment in the United States from any country, not just China. I know we have a focus on China today, but any foreign investment, with the exception of a few countries that I will mention below, that we as the U.S. have very strong national security ties to. And so any transaction of any size is going to be on CFIUS's radar. So Brandon, you can go to the next slide, and then I'll give a little more overview about the composition of CFIUS. So this committee is made up of the heads of the various executive branch departments. So we have Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Commerce, Defense, Department of State, Department of Energy, Office of U.S. Trade Representative, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we've got a huge swath of the federal government and the executive branch. Also, certain White House offices, which are the Office of Management and Budget, Council of Economic Advisors, National Security Council, National Economic Council, Homeland Security Council, and then the Director of National Intelligence and Secretary of Labor are also non-voting members. So you can see that it's anyone who knows anything about the monetary policy of the U.S., about any national security concerns, they are all involved in this. And so in terms of who should care about this, we have really any size deal. No deal is too big or too small to escape CFIUS's interest, depending on the criteria that I'll discuss in a few minutes. Whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, because it doesn't matter which side of the transaction you're on. If it gets derailed, then you are out of luck. You may be an investor, you may be a lender. I know we'll hear on the finance side later from Joel. Even companies that are later acquirers. So let's say you are a company that is now doing business, wants to acquire a U.S. entity. You need to, in your due diligence, you're going to need to look through all the contracts and see if there was any type of foreign investment, because there is no statute of limitations on this. The CFIUS's committee, CFIUS's ability to review transactions and potentially unwind transactions does not have any limit that I found in any statutes based on the timing of it. So you always need to look back and see what was the process of investment in this company back to the beginning. And as I mentioned earlier, that we only have 3 safe harbor countries. So if you are an acquirer from Canada, Australia, or the UK, then you're good, because we already have strong security ties to those countries, and no other countries have any kind of safe harbor. That list may grow, but it's going to be a short list. We know that for sure. So when we're looking at ownership in terms of what CFIUS can do, so think of this in a global term. If based on who the acquirer is or the type of technology that's involved, CFIUS decides that there's a national security concern, then that deal can be undone. So we're looking at any type of transaction. And me as a transactional attorney, I see this as some good cleanup, because back in 2008, CFIUS would only cover controlling interest in companies. But in 2018, when CFIUS was updated, the powers of the committee were updated. We went from just controlling interests in entities to non-controlling interests, to real estate, and even to the right to make decisions. So we're looking much more beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law now. So whether you are doing your acquisition by a stock purchase, asset purchase, merger, reverse merger, whatever it is, if you're doing it in a creative way, this will still be covered. And even minority interests, it could be something as minimal as 1% or even less, because the issue here is how much control are we dealing with, right? Is do you, as a part of your deal, are you going to be able to have the right to make any decisions? Are you going to have, is your company, your outside company, going to have any access to what they call material non-public information, any kind of sensitive data? So I'll go through that criteria in the next slide. But even if you are, even if you're investing in real estate, and the real estate happens to be close to some kind of sensitive U.S. military installation, whether you know about it or not, whether it's on the map or not, and whether it's just a lease, it doesn't even have to be a real estate purchase. So there are lots of things. If you're going to have, if your company as an acquirer is going to be involved at all in any type of these key areas I will show you on the next slide, then you need to know that you'll potentially have to disclose this. And I'm not saying that every deal from every country has to be disclosed. That's part of the analysis, but you need to have it on your radar that this is something that you need to think about because the ramifications are so big. You don't want your deal to be unwound a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 later, and then you have a tight timeline within which to sell your interest, and that's the end of the story. So Brandon, we can go to the next slide. So we're looking at 3 types of industries, right? If you are, let's call you a low-level manufacturer. I have a client I'm working with now that has a China partner that is going to be investing in bringing some manufacturing to the U.S. And we're dealing with originally foreign technology. The Chinese partner has beefed up the technology in a big way, added some significant innovations, and now is bringing that technology to the U.S. That and the product, we're not talking about some of these like semiconductors, right? It's what I consider kind of low level manufacturing. You know, the product is good, but it's not anything that would be problematic from a national security standpoint. And so that's the kind of analysis where we look and say, well, you know, we don't have any technology that's going to be acquired. They're bringing the technology from China, and so our surface level analysis is we don't need to bother CFIUS with this. We don't need to do any kind of review. And so that's what you need to think about as you're going into a transaction. You need to think about this early on in the deal. You know, when you're floating the MOU or the LOI back and forth, you need to think, you know, who's responsible to report? Are we responsible to report? And do we want to do the reporting together? So I'm going to give a few examples here. So if we're looking at critical technologies, critical infrastructure to the US, and any kind of sensitive personal data. So I've got some examples here. On critical technologies, of course, things like semiconductors, any kind of computing-based technology. Recently, Qualcomm was supposed to be acquired by a company out of Singapore, and that deal was unwound, or that it was prohibited from moving forward, and also Lattice Semiconductor Corporation. And I put Qualcomm up there with Singapore in parentheses because I know we feel like China is fairly or unfairly a target of these beefed up regulations, but this was a Singapore company. Most of the other examples I'm going to give are and were Chinese companies that were acquirers, or Chinese groups of companies, or the Chinese companies were part of the mix if there was a bigger group of companies, you know, from Europe and from Asia as well. So any kind of critical technology. If we're looking at critical infrastructure, I put China Telecom on here not because CFIUS whacked the deal, but because this is an example that China Telecom applied for an FCC license several times and was of course not permitted because the national security concerns of giving China Telecom access to our phones, our internet, our satellite communications. We're looking at sensitive personal data. This is more interesting, and I'd say quite widespread, especially in our current era of companies that collect large amounts of personal data. So we have healthcare with a company called Patients Like Me, Grindr, which was a social network app for LGBTQ+. And you can imagine certain large amounts of sensitive data there on individuals, and also the Stay in Touch, which was hotel software, where the acquiring company would, of course, have access to who is staying in what hotels, when, and even things like access to room keys, electronic access to room keys. So some very sensitive areas, and these were deals that were either unwound after the fact, or they were public enough that when the acquisition was made public in some way, the government stepped in and said, this is too sensitive. We're not going to permit that to move forward. Brandon, you can go to the next slide.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to add one other area too. I think, and I'll touch on this in the later slides, but when it comes to what is considered sensitive personal data, that definition is by and large shifting every day. And a lot of it is driven by the political will and the political viewpoints in Washington. So, Grindr, there's now TikTok, which is under review and under scrutiny. So there's a lot of ways that people are interpreting what sensitive data is. And so just because it's on this list doesn't mean it'll necessarily stay as sensitive as it was tomorrow, but more likely the case is that more and more areas are going to be considered sensitive as long as we're in this political climate as it stands today.
And I think that's a great point. I think something that we've noticed lately, of course, with the US and other countries dealing with the fallout from COVID-19 is that we're discovering that our pharmaceutical network is very much at risk if we're producing 80, 90, 100% of, not 100%, but 80, 90% of our inputs are coming from China. And so in terms of the categories that matter, if you think about the critical technology, pharmaceutical as a critical technology, as a critical part of our healthcare infrastructure, and also as containing a critical information, sensitive personal data, I'd say that COVID-19 is one of those instances where we have a nexus to all three of those areas. And so I think as we've talked in the past, Brandon, we'll see some onshoring of the pharmaceutical industry from China as the U.S. tries to bring those home and protect what is becoming very rapidly a national security interest in our national health care. So I'm going to make sure I leave enough time for Brandon and Joel as well. So I'll go through this slide fairly quickly and we can circle back if we want to. But as I mentioned early on in your transaction, when you're floating the LOI back and forth between buyer and seller, you're going to need to think about if you need to report, and if you report, how you report. There are two main ways to do that. There's a declaration filing and there's a notice filing. And the declaration filing is fairly new. It's a streamlined way to report your transaction. It's an 8-page document that you submit online. Well, I mean, I'd say it's quite intrusive because you need to drill down into both sides of the business, the buyer, the seller, all the way up to the parent companies, all the way up to the ultimate owners. And so if you're not prepared as a buyer or a seller to disclose those parts of your deal, then you may want to think twice about going ahead with the transaction. Now, this information is not going to be public record, right? It's going to be submitted. You'll be able to submit it through a database. You encrypt your files. You send the password through encrypted email, and so your deal information is not going to be public. But at the same time, there is this hurdle of having to disclose to the U.S. federal government your transaction and what's going to go on, and that might kill some deals initially. If you're filing the declaration, you should get a decision within 30 days of when they get all your files and decide whether or not that you've done a complete submission. And the filing fees are not supposed to be, they're small enough that they're not supposed to hobble the transaction. And so the maximum amount that the filing fee will be is 15% of 1% of the value of the transaction. So all the way from deals that are under $500,000, it won't have any kind of filing fee. 500,000 to 5 million or 750, and then we tier up kind of by 10% or tenfold. So we have the 5 to 50 million category, $7,500 filing fee. So it's not going to kill your deal, and the most it will be is 300,000. That sounds like a pretty large filing fee, and it is, but we're talking that on deals over $750 million. So it's still just a small percentage of the transaction. Now, in terms of risk, just as I close up here, of course, there are risks with disclosing and risks with not disclosing, right? If we disclosure, you have the filing fee and you have the time, but if you have the time in the deal to do it, then it's not going to be a significant issue. And of course, if you need to file, then you need to file, and there's really no way around that. And it's better to end up at the end of the process, you'll get a comfort letter that says that your transaction has been reviewed, and that precludes a review later. So it's something that's valuable to the transaction, and if you find that your transaction is a covered transaction that needs to be submitted to CFIUS, then you are going to need to have that. It's going to be important for you during the transaction and also down the road if things start to blow up later. So I think that's it, Brandon. I may jump in later during when you and Joel have conversation. I've got parting thoughts as well too. So I'll kick it over to you.
Absolutely, and I'll actually pass it over to Joel, who's going to go over the financial aspects. And I think a lot of our different slides and viewpoints, there's a lot of overlap because it's never just one aspect. It's a myriad of aspects that are taken into consideration. And even in Washington D.C., where I live, the process isn't only just you file a document. There's a lot of back and forth with regulators before you even get there. So that way, by the time you file, you have a pretty good sense of just where people are leaning and what their concerns are initially. But we'll go into that later, and on my slides, and we can touch on that as well. And so I'll pass this over to Joel.
Great, thanks, Brendan. So just to talk about some considerations for foreign LPs and also touch upon IPOs. So as Jonathan mentioned, CFIUS was initially intended on investments where a foreign buyer was seeking to have a large, overwhelming majority stake, ownership or control of a U.S. entity or organization. But over the last couple of years, the rules have been expanded to include also focus on non-controlling investments, which obviously includes minority stakes in companies, depending upon what industry that company is in, what technologies are involved, and as Brendan was mentioning, also looking at some of the personal data concerns as well. Now, even non-controlling interests may be subject to a CFIUS review, where there is significant influence over what is called a important matter or matters of importance, and that includes such as decision-making ability of an actual fund or a general partner in the case of a venture capital or private equity fund. So foreign LPs, because of all these changes, foreign LPs are going to start encountering new scenarios where the general partner will be introducing new language and new terms into their LPA, their limited partner agreement. And the result of that will be that limited partners will begin to have restricted access, limited access to some of the information that may have previously been disclosed whenever you invest money into a venture capital or private equity fund. So if a foreign LP wants to invest in a fund, the foreign LP will just have to accept additional scrutiny, additional disclosures, and also accept diminished access to certain information requests, or else the general partner, the GP, is not going to allow you to invest into their fund. And this is done in a way, it's being done proactively to try to prevent some sort of due diligence review and trying to get onto a CFIUS radar. And so if they could avoid it, obviously that is one way of going about and doing so. Now, as for IPOs, there's many different scenarios that can occur. Let me give you just a general example of what could happen. Let's say that you have a company that announces it wants to IPO on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And that this company, which is a US company, receives a term sheet or an offer of investment from a foreign investor, from a foreign entity. So this is actually common because on the road to an IPO, it is common for one of those IPO candidates to actually be involved in fundraising as part of a way to pay for the IPO or receive additional working capital in order to continue to expand the operation to make themselves look better for the IPO. So if the foreign investor does provide this term sheet, they are going to require something in exchange. And typically that is obviously a controlling or an ownership stake in the company, but also they may want to have the right to appoint a member onto the board of the company. And so if that happens, the foreign investor will have access to confidential information through that board member as a result of that board member's participation. And whether CFIUS needs to review it or not will depend on a couple of things. Will depend on the industry that US company operates in. It may depend on the percent stake, ownership and or control that the foreign investor has in that company. And there's a lot of different factors there. So those are some of the general guidelines that depending upon where the answers to those questions fall out, there may be a CFIUS review waiting for you. Brandon, you can go on to the next slide. Thanks. And so to focus on some of the impacts to venture capital and private equity firms, certainly the general partners are going to be calling for much more greater scrutiny of limited partners that are coming in, especially if there are any national security concerns. And some of these conversations are going to be had earlier rather than later, even as part of the pre-due diligence phase, part of the pre-due diligence review. There is going to be restrictions on sensitive and confidential information, as I mentioned, other than financial data. Financial data obviously still needs to be disclosed. The limited partner has a right to understand the financial situation of investments that are going to be made before they decide to inject any capital into the fund. But they will not have access to material, non-public technical information, especially if it is in an industry that is under focus. And there are limitations on actions that foreign limited partners can take over the general partner. For example, cannot have outsized influence, like influencing decision-making, even if it is through a minority stake in a fund. And other limited partners increasingly want to know, well, who are the other limited partners that are part of this fund, especially if there are foreign limited partners that have been brought on board by the GP. And so this means that there's going to be a greater level of disclosure and scrutiny and transparency, and to the point that some foreign limited partners may not be comfortable with all of that. And then, of course, this is going to create more work in terms of due diligence requests, verifications, et cetera, between the general partner and the foreign limited partner entity. Other factors to consider, you have many industry groups that address some of the concerns for private equity and venture capital firms. These industry groups are actually gathering comments and working with member firms to help craft the representative language for LPA, limited partner agreements, and other documents that takes into account the reality of the new situation. Clearly, this is all under a lot of focus by the US government, but at the same time, they're trying to ensure that these new regulations and sort of the expanded mandate of CFIUS is not going to frustrate some of the passive foreign investments, which is what foreign LPs do through general partner investments in private equity and venture capital funds in the United States. I turn it back to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Joel. I appreciate it. So, from my perspective in Washington, D.C., and also my time in the U.S. government, I think it's really important for any sort of investor, whether you're from China, Russia, France, anywhere, to understand the general trends that the U.S. has towards that country's relations, specifically in this case, China. So it's really impacted by how government attitudes are, all the way down from the president to his appointed administration, who are there to ensure that they support the president. And from there, that attitude is then translated down to the law enforcement officer, the justice official. I mean, it goes down the line. I remember when I was in the Army, whenever there was something negative about another country, and the president had, or a senior leader had said something negative, even if someone had never thought about it before, automatically they think of this country as being a threat, or anything about this country being negative. And this is part of government, part of any big organization but a lot of times, if you see the president being very positive towards a country or positive towards an investment sphere, you're generally going to have a better attitude towards investments in general. Also understand that the president will say one thing, but it may not be the law as well. So Congress, and the judicial system, they're the ones that actually create the laws and interpret the laws. So a lot of time there's always disconnect between those two groups, as well as the individual 50 states, and almost every 50 state requires investment from overseas to run. I had spoken with the director of the International Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles, and he was saying that in California alone, Chinese investment accounts for the bulk of their foreign investment, and that was a big factor. I spoke with the governor of Kentucky about 5 months ago, who was visiting DC to promote foreign investment. And so even though you see it in the news and at a national level, a lot of times the individual states will have their own interests and often have competing priorities with the national security versus the individual growth. And it really is a balance, but you can see how these attitudes will impact how the government administrator will look at each individual case. Also, the media coverage drives a lot of this. So if the media coverage towards one area or a particular sector is negative, then the general public is going to be negative, and that's going to put pressure on the different congressmen and elected representatives. Also, when you look at mainstream media, they're going to either add to that positive or add to that negative attitude as well. And then, like Jonathan said, CFIUS is not just one group. It's an interagency process where everybody has a different say. You have the intelligence community, which is 16, I believe it's 16, I could be wrong, but 16 different entities all providing their input and their piece. The Department of Justice, which includes, you're going to have input from the FBI, you're going to have input from the DEA, all these different people are going to come in. You're going to have input from the Commerce Department. You're going to have input potentially from different embassies. They're going to have everyone in there. So if your business model or if your CFIUS filing is not clear to the person who's never worked in business before, they're going to look at it with a little bit more scrutiny because it doesn't make sense to them. So just understand that even though it makes sense to you and it makes sense to your team filing it, you need to make sure that it is understandable, and that if there are any security concerns or national security concerns, that you have addressed those in a way that anyone can understand. So and there's a balance to be had between this as well, but that's less so necessarily the filing itself, and more so how you explain the business to the outside world. And then also considering one other thing that you need to be concerned about, or not concerned about, but what the government is concerned about is really what is national security. And just like what is sensitive data, the idea of national security changes every day. So before, it used to be considered if it was a dual use technology, can this piece of technology or this investment be used to physically hurt the US? And now it is transferred to the digital and cyberspace. It's transferring now to personal information on dating apps that the individual chose to give that information up to. But now, this is getting even more convoluted because different regulators will say, oh, it's a national security concern. Intelligence and law enforcement community, which are I'd say, your more suspicious entities that are involved, will generally care about the current threats. So if it's widely held in the news, if the president is, really harping on that publicly, that sector is the harder area to get a full investment through. But there's a lot of ways to mitigate it too. For example, the French company Leonardo, defense contractor. They have contracts with the US, but they have to completely separate the US entity and governing body from the French entity as well. You have TikTok, which is now under scrutiny, and they're trying to separate the data flow as well to keep United States data in the United States. The government is also concerned about who are the stakeholders. So with overseas corporate structures, it's unclear who is a government entity, who has a lot of government influence. They want to make sure that there is a separation as well. And unfortunately for many big corporations and even small corporations in China, there's a general suspicion in the government that any Chinese company is going to have government influence. And so part of the job, that your legal team and your PR team, working on CFIUS is going to take into account is how to mitigate this concern, how to improve transparency, or how to create a structure that allows that. Also, from the government standpoint, and the picture on the right you see is back in 2018, I attended an event with the head of CFIUS. So that's the head of CFIUS at the time, where they were discussing the impacts of the new Foreign Investment Review and Modernization Act, FIRMA. So one of the areas that they hit on was emerging technologies, which is a very broad term. But essentially think of an emerging technology as something that can have a dual use between civil and military use. And I think a great example of this is how surveillance and AI applications are being used. The DNA and me, how could that information be used to blackmail, somebody? And it sounds very silly, but these are the concerns that people are thinking about. The reason Grindr was under review is because that personal sensitive information could be embarrassing to somebody and it be used against them. And so there's not a lot of responsibility put on the consumer who agrees to give this information. A lot of it falls on the company. And again, anytime there's a foreign influence, there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny depending on how sensitive that area is. However, there is a positive to all this. However, a lot of risks can be mitigated if you are open and transparent about your intention. Again, as Jonathan said, a lot of it has to do with the spirit of the law, not necessarily the words themselves. So if you understand the spirit of the law and you are acting in good faith to address a risk and offer a mitigation solution, and even before you file, you're having this discussion, that can really reduce the concerns of the government entities as well. And and there's a lot of ways to do it. One other example I want to bring up, and then I'll open it up for general questions. But one other example is that investments into the United States, for example, BlackRock, they have tons and tons of Chinese investors, but they've had to structure their deals in a way that mitigates any of these type of risks, so that way they can still invest into U.S. Real estate or companies, or different funds without worrying that their foreign investors, Chinese, Brazilian, wherever, it doesn't matter, but without their foreign investors coming under scrutiny for having undue influence into the actual operations or have control or access to sensitive information. So again, this is just what we're seeing from the discussions in Washington, D.C. and in the government. So I hope this can kind of give a broader picture to how, when you're looking at your investments into the United States, how to, one, address them, how to assess whether there is a national security concern, and then if you feel there is, or if someone else feels there is, how to think through some of the mitigation factors. Joel or Jonathan, I don't know if you had any final thoughts on this, and we can take questions after this as well.
I think you make a great point, and probably we can underscore that, which is this is a back and forth process. If during the time you file your declaration and the CFIUS wants more information, then you'll be filing a notice, and the notice, like you said, there will be a lot of back and forth, and as you file you show them the draft notice as you're interacting with the committee. They ultimately want to understand the deal as well as you do, and they will be working with you to, as you try to come up with a creative way to keep your sensitive data sequestered, right? I mean, if there's a way for the deal to go through with the, with the information being sequestered or with certain parties being sequestered, and when you're doing investment into the U.S., you're going to have U.S. personnel that you'll want to hire, and so if you can structure a way that that will make the committee happy, that the goal is to help business keep going. The U.S. I think is always going to be open for business, and if there's a creative legal way to make that happen, I think that you'll be able to make it happen. So I think that that we shouldn't despair that there's going to be a review process. It's just part of what we need to deal with as we're doing the negotiation and planning what the U.S. venture will look like.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Brandon and Jonathan are saying, I think that flexibility is the key. I think foreign LPs will have to be flexible. You are going to run into situations where they have made already existing investments into certain companies. And if they don't want to have to deal with a divestiture where they have to completely unwind and exit the investment, they may have to consider dialing back their investment, their controlling stake, their ownership stake. So they may have to reduce, by X% their ownership stake in a company, and or even give up a board seat if they have a board seat in that company. And so flexibility is the key. And the government does try to be reasonable. And if through flexibility, if you're able to work something out with the government where it allows the foreign LPs or foreign investors to maintain their investment in the United States, by all means, they should grab that opportunity and take it.
Great, and we'll leave this here, but we'll start taking some questions as well. We really appreciate everyone sticking in and contributing. And Jonathan, I think you might be best positioned to answer this, but there was a question. Suppose a U.S. company is already foreign owned, and that foreign ownership, for example, based in Hong Kong, is now sold to a mainland Chinese company. Is that transaction captured under CFIUS?
Yes, think about it from the government's perspective, which is we have the risk factor changing now. If you're going from Brandon said a French company to a Hong Kong company or a German company, even French to German, if they're ally countries, the risk may be similar, but it still needs an entirely new assessment. And you want to err on the side of disclosure and working. If you have nothing to hide, right, or you're willing to make it happen because you're willing to work with the regulators because the deal is important, then you are going to need to disclose and deal with that. And so it's good to think about that ahead of time. Of course, anything that has to do with Hong Kong or mainland China will be increased scrutiny. But if we're dealing with an Indonesian company that's investing in the U.S., we're going to have the same kind of risk analysis that will need to happen. So yeah, I would say yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. And also consider too, they want to know, it doesn't mean that transaction can't happen. It doesn't mean that transaction won't happen. It just means that you have to be aware of this as a matter of process, and be open and transparent in who that ownership is transferring to, and also understand that industry. If you're talking about pet toys, or when we've had this, we've done a national security review for pet toys, but you really don't know, and it's good to err on the side of caution. But at the end of the day, the government wants to know who is taking ownership. How is this going to impact or not impact your national security, which is much broader now, so since U.S. person data, for example. So take that into consideration. One other question: when private equity takes on foreign investors, should they do due diligence, and how? To jump in real quick, if it's a U.S. firm, yes, they should do due diligence, because you should always know who your investors are, and also and there's a wide variety of ways to do that. But I'll let Joel and Jonathan jump in on this first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brendan. So absolutely, there is due diligence. If a foreign investor wants to make an investment in a private equity fund, the general partner, even without CFIUS, they will do what is called the KYC. Everybody wants to do that. You have to know who your customer is, who your investors are. And so there's a lot of documentation that needs to be submitted, interviews of management, management background, articles of incorporation. There's a lot of documentation that needs to be provided to the general partner. So, hopefully, if you took a key message away from the presentation tonight, you'll see that that documentation, that verification request is going to create extra work, and it's only going to increase as a result of CFIUS, because other limited partners will want to know if there are any foreign limited partners that are going to invest in that fund. And some may shy away if a foreign limited investor, a foreign limited partner comes into a fund. They don't want to take a chance that they may be asked to exit at some point. And so everybody wants to know who else is coming into the fund. And so transparency, disclosure is key. And that is just going to place more emphasis on the whole due diligence process. And it's going to take a little bit longer.
Great. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, and there's the, to follow up on that, when it comes to how they do the due diligence, a lot of it is just requesting documentation. If there are any concerns or questions that haven't been addressed, or areas where the investors, non-traditional areas where the private equity firm wants to look at, for example, doing a social media assessment, doing a whole person assessment, identifying who those people are connected to behind the scenes and stuff like that. It can go that far, but most of the time, as long as the investor is answering the questions of the PE, or the general partner, then it doesn't necessarily go that far most of the time. One question. Oh, thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. One question: how does CFIUS affect Greenfield investments? Either
I can weigh in on.
Joel.
I'll weigh in on that. So the Greenfield will depend mainly on where the real estate is that you're going to be using, right? If you have discussed earlier, if this is even if this is a lease, even if we call it concession, right? If you have any access to any kind of real estate as part of your Greenfield, and usually as a Greenfield, we're talking about acquiring a parcel and doing something on it, then yes, we'll have to go through that analysis, although it's a different analysis if we're just looking at the proximity of your real estate to any kind of sensitive US government or military installation or ports if you're on the coast. And that's a different analysis, but it's still part of CFIUS analysis in how the real estate is going to be used and where it is. If you're bringing your own technology, as in a Greenfield's investment, and not acquiring US technology or company, then it's a much different analysis, part of it, but it's I'd say less scrutiny than if you were acquiring some startup that has a key tech component to it.
Yeah, good insight. And I think too, from the DC perspective, the regulators as well, they understand that there's certain areas that are less impactful. And I think, to Jonathan's point, if you're, CFIUS was originally, the intent was to assess investments into already existing companies and technology and areas. So, if your investment falls outside of that, it's good to have this type of analysis conducted, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go through the exact same process as if you were acquiring, a technology company or a startup, or, being a minority investor into a defense contractor or something like that. Or, so there's a lot of different, different ways, but it's good to do the analysis first, and that sometimes that's part of the market research, sometimes that's its own standalone review. And I think it's good to talk. You always want to talk to a lawyer first, when it comes to this type of stuff. So it's good to have that question ready. And if there's any more questions that people have, please let us know. If you have any questions for any of us, our emails are at the bottom. If no more questions, we really appreciate you taking the time, and we hope you have a good day. Shoot us an email if you have any comments or feedback on the webinar itself. And again, if you need to get a hold of Joel or Jonathan or myself, please let us know. But we appreciate you taking the time, and we hope you have a good day.